Before we get started, a quick heads up. Presidents Unplugged now has merch. If you want to support the show and represent the podcast in your daily life, you can at presidentsunpluggedmerch.com. That is presidentsunpluggedmerch.com. Now, let's get into today's episode. How could you find any success in life if you always ended up in second? John Adams knows that feeling more than almost anybody else in American history. From the moment he stepped into politics, he always seemed to be standing in someone else's shadow. Never quite the main guy, never the loudest voice in the room, and yet his career still ended up being unbelievably successful as one of the defining early American politicians. How can the man, who always comes in second, really end up on top? This is the story of John Adams, the man in second. Let's do this. Born in Braintree, Massachusetts in 1735, John Adams grew up in a modest farming family. He had a strict upbringing that taught him discipline early, but he was never really meant for the farm life. He preferred reading, thinking, and debating rather than working on the fields. At 15 years old, he entered Harvard College, showing early signs of a sharp and restless mind. After graduating and later earning his master's degree, Adams became a schoolteacher, teaching grammar and studying figures like Cicero and other classic philosophers. But teaching was never going to define him. He soon moved into law in Boston, quickly building a reputation as honest, stubborn, and deeply committed to fairness. Even when people disagreed with him, they respected that he stood by principle. Those ideas would soon be tested in one of the most controversial moments of his early career. In 1770, tensions between Britain and the American colonies were boiling over. On March 5th, British soldiers in Boston were surrounded by an angry crowd throwing snowballs and even stones. The soldiers fired their weapons, killing several colonists in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Now think about this. If British soldiers just fired into a crowd of John Adams's fellow colonists, whose side would he take? For John Adams, the answer shocked people. He chose to defend the British soldiers in court. Wait a second, does that mean John Adams is a British sympathizer? Not at all. Adams believed something bigger was at stake: fair trials and the rule of law. Even when it made him unpopular, he believed justice had to apply to everyone. Some were furious, others respected him more, but this moment showed exactly who Adams was. As tension between Britain and the colonies continued to rise, Adams increasingly leaned towards independence. Taxes like the Stamp Act and other taxes that felt like punishments, like the Intolerable Acts, pushed the colonies further apart from Britain. Adams became one of the loudest voices in the Continental Congress pushing for independence, helping convince hesitant colonists that breaking away and declaring independence was necessary. While Thomas Jefferson often gets all the credit for the Declaration of Independence, Adams was one of the key forces pushing it forward behind the scenes. And just like many times later in his career, he often found himself just outside of the spotlight. After declaring independence, the United States' first attempt at a governmental system was called the Articles of Confederation. While on the surface this seemed like an okay way to run the government, there were many problems when it came to federal versus states' rights, which caused lots of unnecessary debates, and it wasn't working out very well. So the United States adopted a new constitution, creating the offices of President and Vice President. In the first presidential election in 1789, George Washington won unanimously. Being the leader of the Continental Army and being sort of the first American celebrity, that part was no surprise. But under the original system, each elector casts 2 votes. The top vote-getter out of the candidates became the president, and the runner-up became the vice president. And that runner-up was John Adams, the man in second. You would think being the second most powerful person in the country would come with real authority. Washington was being called His Excellency. So Adams suggested a more formal title for the vice president, maybe even His Highness. This idea did not go over well. Critics immediately mocked him, joking that he should be called His Rotundity, meaning round or plump. Adams also quickly grew frustrated with this vice presidential role. He presided over the Senate and broke tie votes, but not much else. Even after a few key tie-breaking votes dealing with the beginning of the country, he famously called the office the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived. Contrived is our word of the day. Contrived, something artificially planned, forced, or unnatural. You think John Adams was a little bitter? Or maybe he was just realizing what it meant to always be second to a national legend like George Washington. But eventually, that spotlight would have to be moved. After 2 terms, George Washington stepped down, leaving behind enormous shoes to fill, and I'm not just talking about the fact that George Washington was over 6 foot, while John Adams was the height of your grandma. America was kind of scared. Washington was not just the president, he was the symbol of the entire nation. And now, he was gone. But in 1796, John Adams finally had his opportunity for the spotlight when he won the presidency of the United States, becoming our second American president. But under the old system, the runner-up became vice president, just how John Adams entered the position. That meant that Thomas Jefferson, his old ally from the Declaration of Independence, now became his vice president. The problem? Adams was a Federalist, and Jefferson was a Democratic Republican. They disagreed on almost everything. It would be like forcing Hillary Clinton to be Donald Trump's vice president after the election of 2016. Sharing the same administration and just somehow hoping it would work out. This led the country into disaster. The setup eventually led to the 12th Amendment being passed after John Adams was president in 1804, which made presidents and vice presidents run on the same ticket. Instead of forcing political opponents to share power and clash constantly. But before this amendment was passed, Adams and Jefferson, We're going to have to just deal with each other and work through the disaster for the next 4 years. Abraham Lincoln was 6'4". Franklin Delano Roosevelt served as president for more than 4,000 days. Those are facts. But here's another fact. The fact that Presidents Unplugged has an Instagram page. If you want updates on the show and announcements about what's coming next, follow us at Presidents_Unplugged. That is Presidents_Unplugged. I'll see you there. Adams's presidency was difficult from the start. He was constantly compared to Washington, and many members of his own cabinet were more loyal to Alexander Hamilton, another leader in the Federalist Party, than to him. One of the most controversial parts of his presidency was the Alien and Sedition Acts. Sedition refers to encouraging rebellion against the government. Federalists believed that these laws were necessary to protect stability during dangerous times. Critics saw them as an attack on free speech. This sparked one of the earliest major debates over liberty versus security in America. At the same time, Adams strengthened the United States Navy, helping build American power in the sea just like on land, because tensions with Britain and France weren't going to slow down anytime soon. And if you know Britain, they're fully surrounded by water and had the greatest navy the world had ever seen. This was a critical step for young America, still trying to prove itself to the rest of the world that we weren't playing around. Near the end of his presidency, Adams made last-minute judicial appointments known as the Midnight Judges. Now, why in the world would you elect people to judiciary courts if you're about to be done with your presidential term? It was an attempt to preserve Federalist influence after he left office, just in case the Democratic Republicans decided to win the presidency. All of this led up to the chaotic election of 1800. Adams, Jefferson, and Hamilton were all tangled up in political conflict. Even within the Federalist Party, Hamilton worked directly against Adams, weakening his chances. So in the end, Thomas Jefferson reigned supreme. And just like that, John Adams had lost again. Second to Washington, second to Jefferson. The man in second had lost the top spot once again. But history was not finished with John Adams, and it surely wasn't finished with Thomas Jefferson. After writing the Declaration of Independence together, they pretty much lost connection. They stuck to their own independent party and had a weird bitterness towards one another. But after Jefferson's 8 years as president, they unexpectedly reconnected later in life. They exchanged more than 150 letters, shifting from opposite political rivals to best friends. They disagreed all the time, but they shared a deep respect and love for that country that they worked together to help build. And then history took a turn that nobody saw coming. On July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, yeah, the one that Thomas Jefferson and Adams wrote, Thomas Jefferson died. A founding father dying on the nation's 50th birthday already feels symbolic enough, and maybe it was just a coincidence. But then, just hours later, in a completely different part of the country, John Adams also died on the very same day. 2 founding fathers, 2 presidents, 2 rivals turned friends, both gone on the 50th anniversary of America's independence. One of the most unbelievable coincidences in American history. Ending Adams's life in a way that nobody could have expected. Throughout John Adams's life, there was a constant trend. This man always came in second. Being the first vice president or the second in command. Becoming the second president. Losing second in the race in 1800. He was often overshadowed by the louder figures in history. But even if he seemed to always come in second, one thing never changed. His dedication to America always came first. And that is why John Adams is so important. Tune in next Friday as we talk about Gerald Ford. If you had the option to play for the Green Bay Packers or go to law school, which one would you pick? Gerald Ford deciding to go to law school changed the course of his life. He eventually became our 38th president. But wait, I didn't elect you as my president. I mean, I know I didn't elect you as my vice president. Who are you? Learn about that and much more next week on Presidents Unplugged. I'm Ty Svensson, and I'll see you soon. God bless. Thank you for listening to Presidents Unplugged. If you enjoy content like this, give us a follow on Apple Podcasts or Spotify today to be notified that your favorite presidential podcast has released new content. Now, when do we release new content? Once a month, maybe twice a year, maybe even once a year? No. We release new content every Friday at 1 p.m. for my American enthusiasts to enjoy. Come join me on our dive into making American history the most entertaining and interesting subject to learn every single week. I'm Ty Svensson, this is Presidents Unplugged, and I'll see you soon.